I don't think somebody like Matviyenko would necessarily come to rescue Putin out of principle. I think she would just follow the crowd to wherever the power lies. But in reality, she is so closely tied to Putin. As Putinism ends, and it will end at some point in the next 10 to 15 years because Putin's an old man, we have to ask, will those people still hold power, and will those kinds of people still hold power afterwards? Because if they do, that's when the system, even if it goes quiet for a while, may at some point begin to recreate itself in its most violent forms at some point in the future.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes, and today we're joined by Dr Ian Garner, Professor of Russia and War Propaganda at the Puletsky Institute. He's also author of the book Generation Z, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. Dr Garner, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, Kiev has voiced some pretty stiff opposition to Valentina Matviyenko attending a gathering of women speakers of parliament this week in Switzerland. What do we know about this woman and her connection to Putin?
Well, Matviyenko is a senior Russian politician, and her connection to Putin goes back a long, long time, back to the 1990s when they were both involved in the early years of post-Soviet politics in St. Petersburg together. And she is through and through a Putin supporter and a Putin insider, and has gone from strength to strength, really, over the last 25 years under Putin's rule.
And she came up from St. Petersburg, which is Putin's home city as well. How did she get into her position today, and when did she become involved in Putin's regime? Because she was also involved with the previous Boris Yeltsin administration, wasn't she?
I think we can actually start a little bit earlier because it tells you something about the kind of figure she is. And I think the kind of people who excel in Putinist politics more broadly. And that is, you can go back to the mid-1980s when she entered politics for the first time. Now, many of our listeners will know that Putin was a KGB agent in the 1980s, when Matviyenko was also a communist insider. She graduated university, and of course, to go to university back then, you had to be a communist insider, you had to be a diligent communist youth, and then she immediately entered the bureaucracy in the 80s, and she had a couple of minor positions before the end of communism. Now, through the 1990s, like many other communists, she quickly changed stripes and went to work for the new government. She was involved in the foreign service. She had a couple of minor diplomatic posts. I believe, although don't quote me on this, but I believe she was an ambassador to a couple of smaller countries. If not, then she was fairly high up in the diplomatic missions of a couple of countries. And then she came back to St. Petersburg. And that was when she really got involved with Putin, who, of course, was high up in St. Petersburg politics before he was quite suddenly, at the end of the 90s, appointed as prime minister and then suddenly president-elect on the closing in the closing hours of the 1990s. And from then on, it's just been moving further and further into the stratosphere to the point where some people call her the most powerful woman in Russia today.
Yeah, and it's quite the title, that, the most powerful woman in Russia. How did she manage to navigate the politics of the Kremlin that can be deadly for some, especially under Putin?
Well, the politics are always deadly for some, but Matviyenko is so emblematic of what it takes to be successful in the Putinist era, because that little potted version of her career I've just given you tells you that she is somebody who really isn't committed to very much, ideologically speaking. And if you look at her Putinist career, we can find out even more about the sort of bizarre about turns that the individuals who are at the top of the tree today can indulge in. Because in the 2000s, she became governor of St. Petersburg. And back in the 2000s, she essentially pursued a pretty pro-business policy in the city. She encouraged a number of major Western auto manufacturers to move into the city. I remember I was living in St. Petersburg at the time, and there was just an influx of engineers from Spain and Germany and indeed Britain all over the world coming in because St. Petersburg was a good place to be. It was a good place to engineer and a good place to manufacture. And so, she looked like she was one of these people who could kind of navigate power and be pro-business. And that was welcomed by the West at the time, right? That was when Putin was quite happily meeting George Bush, was meeting Tony Blair. Russia was seen as if somewhat iffy in terms of domestic politics, reliable international partner, economically speaking. And yet you look at the things that Matviyenko has said and done over the last 10 years as she's moved out of this regional politics into a national federal role. She's chairperson of the Federal Council, which is effectively the Russian Senate, the House of Lords, whatever you want to call it, the upper chamber. And she is absolutely, or appears to be, a paid up member of the propaganda brigade. She is all for the invasion of Ukraine. She was one of the first people sanctioned in 2014 when Crimea was annexed. She oversaw the very flawed and fake referendum vote that saw the residents of Crimea, quote unquote, join Russia. And she was the one who signed off on 2022 and the invasion and the decision to invade. Right? So here we have somebody who seems to believe in nothing at all. If you follow Putin, you can do well.
And why did Ukraine object to her presence specifically at this gathering in Switzerland? Is it just because of her closeness to Putin?
There are a number of reasons, some of which are ideological. She is somebody who's spoken out very strongly in these Putinist terms about needing to annex and invade Ukraine, claiming, as she has done in Switzerland, claiming that Ukraine had to invade because there are fascists. That Russia had to invade because there are fascists in Ukraine. That there was no other option. That Ukraine is shelling and killing its own civilians. So you can see that part of the objection, but there is also a legal pragmatic objection in that she is sanctioned by Europe, and Switzerland is signed up to the treaties that she's involved with. And so the argument that Kiev makes, I think pretty fairly, is why should she be allowed to come to Switzerland and operate openly and be treated as somebody who's a legitimate member of a democratic governing body.
And is it clear why she was allowed to enter? Because she is under sanctions by Switzerland and the EU, and the reaction was the same by many other lawmakers. It's been reported that EU lawmakers walked out when she stood up to speak.
Possibly the answer is simply pragmatic, in that refusing the request to go could create a political football where the Russian authorities say we're not being treated fairly, Europe won't engage with us. Now, I'm not saying I believe that argument or I don't. I'm just trying to, work through what some of the reasons might be. And purely in terms of practical affairs, Switzerland made the request to other countries to allow Matviyenko's plane to, and there were some other Russian parliamentarians as well, which has irked the Ukrainian authorities even more, allowed that plane to cross European airspace where other Russian airplanes are not allowed to do so. But the answer really is, I think, Ukraine is worried that this might signal that countries like Switzerland are willing to engage in a rapprochement on diplomatic terms in a way with Russia that they haven't done over the last few years, and that this could be the slow start of a move back towards welcoming Russia into the international fold.
And as you say, she's been particularly vocal on the invasion of Ukraine, hasn't she? Where does that apparent strength of feeling come from?
Well, with these Putinist politicians, it's always very hard to know because they are closed books. Most of the talk that Matviyenko has given around this issue really seems to be rehashed versions of this stock propaganda of lines that are familiar to all of us. You could pretty much open a Putin speech and a Matviyenko speech or commentary on this and struggle to tell the difference about who is actually speaking. And that's part of a broader propaganda strategy that the state takes simply to continually bombard us on social media, in mainstream media, with the same set of stories over and over and over again until finally they break through, they begin to be shared, they begin to be normalized. And it's not clever, but it is a strategy that works. We know that some people in the West certainly buy it, even believing some of the material that is just outright fake, as well as the stuff that is contorted or distorted or very heavily biased. And with somebody like Matviyenko in particular, I just wonder what would happen if the Russian government tomorrow completely changed its tune. I can totally see somebody like her just following along with whatever the melody is. I don't think she really believes in anything at all. Now, there are ideologues in the Kremlin. There are people who really believe in the most extreme versions of this sort of neo-imperial, quasi-fascist language about needing to destroy Ukraine. But I'd be surprised if Matviyenko is really one of them.
Given her position of power, what does that say about Putin's inner circle? I mean, who do you think holds more sway then? Those ideologues, the nationalists who truly believe in the invasion of Ukraine and the power that Russia should have in the world, or these yes people, as it were, who are a bit more vague in their own ideologies and are more there to serve Putin as a leader?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. You might say that Putin has all the power, because it's clear to me that somebody like Matviyenko and many other politicians in her kind of position really have no power of their own. If she were chosen as a scapegoat for things that are going wrong, either domestically or in the Ukraine war tomorrow, there'd be no stopping Putin from getting rid of her. And therefore, does she have any real say, apart from her ability, of course, to speak out and say no and take a principled stance in moving Putin in another direction? You could say no, she doesn't really. Putin makes all the decisions. And yet, you could also look at reality, and the fact is that over the last 12, 13, 14 years, Russia has become increasingly nationalist, increasingly ultra-nationalist, increasingly violent and aggressive, increasingly draconian at home, and say that really the nationalists have power. They certainly seem to have Putin's ear, and the nationalists, unlike the moderates, are the people who are allowed to speak out and even criticize Putin to some extent and say he's not going far enough without risking punishment. Unlike the moderates, and certainly unlike the liberals in Russia, who are completely silent, whether out of fear or out of having been already punished, jailed, and browbeaten in all sorts of other ways.
And you've talked about her political ideology and guiding principles, or perhaps lack thereof. If Putin did face significant opposition, or was even pushed out of power by someone like the nationalist movement, are people like Valentina Matviyenko coming to rescue him or sticking by him in that situation, do you think?
But, I mean, it's a big if, right? So we're playing some fantasy Kremlin football here. But I don't think somebody like Matviyenko would necessarily come to rescue Putin out of principle. I think she would just follow the crowd to wherever the power lies. But in reality, she is so closely tied to Putin, where she came from, how she's got to where she's got today, and in the way that she's transformed herself over the last few years. And bearing in mind her age as well, because she's about the same age as Putin, early to mid 70s, it's very hard to see her doing anything other than working overtime behind the scenes to make sure that Putin stays in power for as long as possible.
And so, to finish, Ian, what does Valentina Matviyenko's position and her rise to power say about Putin's Russia and the nature of its politics and leadership, do you think?
What it really tells us, aside from the fact that anyone can believe anything, and your character, your personality, your beliefs can be rewritten and recreated overnight, nobody really minds, it tells us that there is a large block of people in power who are just like Matviyenko, who have followed this exact trajectory, who are, yes, they're corrupt. Yes, they love to embezzle. Yes, it's a kleptocratic country. But those are exactly the very people, and that is exactly the very system that enables the worst excesses of Putinism, because they are the people who will call the vote on Crimea. They are the people who will sign off on the decisions. They are the people who will read out the script that will call for the destruction of Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. And when there are also a great number of people who do believe in the spiritual kind of aspects of the conflict and do believe that Ukraine needs to be invaded and needs to be destroyed, and that Russia is somehow sort of wilting away under the constant attack of Western ideals, LGBTQ, of music, sport, films, you name it. That's how we end up in the situation we're in today. And so as Putinism ends, and it will end at some point in the next 10 to 15 years because Putin's an old man, we have to ask, will those people still hold power, and will those kinds of people still hold power afterwards? Because if they do, that's when the system, even if it goes quiet for a while, may at some point begin to recreate itself in its most violent forms at some point in the future.
Well, Dr. Ian Garner, Professor of Russia and War Propaganda at the Putins Institute, and also author of the book Generation Z, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascists. Thank you very much for speaking with me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you.